The understanding of rumination frequently presupposes a solitary origin. It is accepted that the recurring thoughts, the cycles of consideration, arise as a distinct phenomenon generated solely by the mind. This presumption appears justifiable upon initial observation. The subjective quality of rumination presents as a dialogue, a sequence of reflections occurring within the perceived boundaries of consciousness. The feeling of internal generation is a powerful element in this belief. This viewpoint finds continued support through a focus on internal monologue. Attention is drawn to the language employed, the narratives constructed. External circumstances receive comparatively little consideration during periods of rumination. Analysis tends toward the internal workings of thought, minimizing the impact of what precedes and surrounds that thought. However, closer examination demonstrates a pattern. The subject matter of rumination, the particular concerns or regrets that surface, often demonstrates correlation with prior sensory input. Emotional responses previously elicited by external stimuli find their way into the ruminative cycle. A persistent feeling of inadequacy, for example, might mirror experiences of criticism encountered earlier in life. Similarly, anxieties regarding social interaction often trace back to past instances of perceived rejection. These observations suggest a causal relationship extending beyond the perceived limits of individual mental processes. The link between external circumstance and internal thought is not one of simple causation. It is not that an external event directly precipitates a ruminative episode. Instead, the environment shapes the raw material of the internal dialogue. The mind draws from a reservoir of experiences, interpreting and reinterpreting those experiences within a framework established by prior interactions. The intensity of the rumination is often proportional to the emotional charge associated with those initial external encounters. A minor disagreement, if perceived as a profound failure, will generate a more protracted cycle of self-criticism. It is crucial to avoid isolating external factors as independent causal agents. The impact of external circumstance is always mediated by the internal landscape. The same event will evoke different responses in different individuals, and in the same individual at different times. The capacity to perceive an event as threatening or as indicative of personal worth is itself a product of prior experiences and therefore internal to the system. This interaction underscores the conditional nature of the original presumption. The feeling of a solitary origin is contingent upon a limited perspective. The assumption that rumination is born exclusively within the mind requires a deliberate blindness to the pervasive influence of external factors. It demands a disregard for the ongoing interplay between sensation, emotion, and thought. The subjective certainty of internal generation does not negate the evidence of external dependence. The pattern emerges clearly when the focus shifts from the feeling of origination to the content itself. The perceived separation between mind and environment dissolves under sustained observation. The persistent review of past events finds common ground in the notion that such reviews accurately reflect what occurred. The repetition of these sequences, the returning to specific moments, suggests a fidelity to the original experience. This conviction bolsters the process. The more frequently an event is revisited, the more credible its depiction becomes. Dissatisfaction frequently arises when the recalled event is perceived as unfavorable, leading to repetitive examination and an attempt to understand or rectify the situation. The discomfort intensifies when the recall deviates from an expected outcome or a desired portrayal of self. This assumption rests upon a particular conceptual framework. It presumes a linear progression of time, a sequence extending from past to present. It further implies that the cognitive action of retrieval provides a direct conduit to the original event. The act of remembering, therefore, is equated with accurate recall. A sequence unfolds, an event happens, it is encoded, it is stored, it is retrieved, and the retrieved version is identical to the original. This framework is integral to the experience of rumination. However, scrutiny reveals a different process at work. Memory is not a recording, it is a reconstruction. Each recall involves rebuilding a representation from fragmented elements. These elements are invariably influenced by subsequent experiences. Emotional states at the time of encoding impact the storage. Later beliefs shape the reconstruction. The perceived accuracy of a memory is relative to the current context. The process of encoding itself is selective. Not every aspect of an event is retained. Certain details are emphasized while others are diminished. This selection is not random. It is conditioned by attention, motivation, and pre-existing cognitive structures. Retrieval is similarly selective. What surfaces is not a complete picture, but a partial narrative assembled from available fragments. Each assembly is unique. Each iteration introduces the possibility of alteration. The perceived stability of a memory derives from the conviction that it represents a concrete, unchangeable fact. This belief supports the assumption that the review of past events offers reliable insight. Yet, this conviction is itself a product of the very process it seeks to validate. The repeated return to a memory solidifies its perceived reality, despite the inherent instability of its composition. The notion of a fixed, immutable memory creates a space for regret. It fosters a longing for an altered past. It provides a foundation for self-blame. The discomfort intensifies as the individual attempts to reconcile the perceived reality of the past with the conditions of the present. The persistence of rumination reinforces the illusion of accuracy. The assumption that recalling an event yields a reliable representation dissolves upon examination of memory's mechanics. It fails to account for the reconstructive nature of recall, the impact of emotion, the influence of subsequent experience, and the selective nature of both encoding and retrieval. The sequence breaks down. There is only a constantly shifting rendering. The original event is inaccessible. The persistent sense of importance assigned to certain mental contents is readily accepted. It is a structure already in place, a habitual lens. Within this lens, particular thoughts appear to possess an inherent gravity, a weight that demands attention. This perceived weight generates a tendency toward continued engagement, a looping examination of the originating thought. The more attention is given, the more substantial the thought seems to become. This amplification is not a consequence of the thought itself, but of the surrounding apparatus. The feeling of significance is not an inherent property. It is an attribution. A framework allows for the designation of specific thoughts as important, relevant, or meaningful. Without this framework, the thought would simply exist, an event in the ongoing stream of consciousness. It would neither possess nor lack weight. The attribution of significance leads to discomfort. Repeated engagement with a thought, regardless of its initial nature, can produce a state of dissatisfaction. This arises not from the content of the thought, but from the investment in it. The investment demands justification. The ongoing cycle seeks to validate the initial attribution. This generates further thought, focused on the original thought, creating a feedback loop. The discomfort is a product of this loop, not a product of the thought's inherent qualities. Consider the mechanism of attribution. It is a process of comparison. A thought is deemed important because it is perceived to be different from other thoughts. It is deemed relevant because it is perceived to connect to other thoughts or experiences. These distinctions, however, are constructed. They are based on arbitrary criteria. The criteria themselves are shaped by individual inclinations. What one person deems important, another will not. The framework is subjective, a personal arrangement. The subjective nature of the attribution is readily demonstrated through shifts in perspective. A thought deemed significant at one time might be regarded as trivial at another. This alteration does not represent a change in the thought itself. It represents a change in the interpretive framework. The conditions that led to the initial attribution have altered. The connection to personal biases, cognitive framing, and circumstantial relevance has been disrupted. The perceived weight vanishes. The absence of weight does not signify a loss. It simply reveals the emptiness of the original claim. The thought itself remains an occurrence without inherent gravity. The discomfort associated with the thought dissipates as the framework that generated it collapses. There is no need to replace it. The absence of a framework is not a void. It is a condition of neutrality. It allows for the unobstructed flow of experience. The feeling of importance was never present within the event itself. It was projected. It ceases to exist when the projection is withdrawn. The cessation of projection yields a state of quiet. The feeling persists, a sense of possession. Something holds the thought, guides its turns, and registers its impact. This feeling, familiar and seemingly unshakable, suggests a foundational structure, a self that is the locus of rumination. It is a direct experience, seemingly beyond question. The very act of analyzing the process reinforces the sense of an observing entity. This perceived ownership arises from a consistent pattern of mental processing. Language itself lends credence to the notion. Sentences are structured around subjects. Actions are attributed to actors. The pronoun I functions as a default referent, a grammatical placeholder for the presumed source of thought. This linguistic structure, prevalent across communication, solidifies the assumption of a possessing self. The continuity of experience contributes to the feeling of ownership. Memories, intentions, and sensations are woven into a personal history, providing a seemingly unbroken chain linking past, present, and future. This continuity generates the impression of a permanent identity, something that endures through change. The individual appears to be the unchanging observer of an ever-changing landscape of experience. However, careful examination reveals the conditional nature of this perception. The sense of ownership arises not from a pre-existing entity, but from the interaction of interdependent factors. Thought emerges from a complex network of neural activity, shaped by genetics, environment, and past experiences. These elements combine to create a provisional narrative, an ongoing construction rather than a fixed reality. The narrative organizes experience, providing a framework for understanding and prediction. The narrative self is not an inherent property of existence. It is a functional arrangement. It serves the purpose of coherence, allowing the individual to navigate a complex world. Without this narrative, experience would be a chaotic jumble of sensations and impulses. The narrative simplifies, orders, and provides a sense of agency. Yet, this utility does not equate to ontological reality. The feeling of possession is a consequence of mistaking the narrative for the self. Dissatisfaction arises when the narrative is perceived as definitive, as representing a core identity. Discrepancies between the narrative and the unfolding of experience generate anxiety and a sense of inadequacy. The desire to protect the narrative, to maintain its consistency, leads to attachment and aversion. This attachment perpetuates the cycle of rumination, reinforcing the very assumption it seeks to avoid. Consider the implications if the narrative were suddenly disrupted. A traumatic event, a neurological condition, or simply a shift in perspective could shatter the sense of ownership. The individual might experience a profound disorientation, a loss of bearings. Yet, this disorientation does not signify a loss of existence. It reveals the constructed nature of the perceived self. The mental events continue, but the feeling of possession dissolves. The experience remains, unaltered in its fundamental character. The feeling of possession, once recognized as a construct, loses its solidity. The narrative remains a useful tool, but its claim to represent a substantive self diminishes. It is an arrangement of elements, an ongoing process, not an enduring entity. It is the story, not the storyteller. The thought simply arises and passes. The perception of rumination as aberrant originates in a fundamental misunderstanding. It is assumed that a particular form of cognitive activity constitutes a departure from a mental norm. This designation carries consequences, primarily the attribution of negative value. The subsequent experience of distress when such rumination occurs serves to reinforce this initial assessment. Distress is a characteristic element, but it is not inherently linked to the activity itself. The expectation of a normal mental state is a construct. It implies a baseline, a default setting against which deviations can be measured. This baseline is not universally agreed upon, nor is its existence objectively verifiable. It is a standard established through cultural transmission and individual internalization. The perception of rumination as a deviation, therefore, depends entirely upon the pre-existing assumption of this norm. Without that assumption, the cognitive activity holds no intrinsic status. The experience of distress arises not from rumination itself, but from the judgment imposed upon it. The label aberrant carries an implicit condemnation. This condemnation triggers a secondary process, aversion. Aversion generates discomfort. The discomfort is then attributed to the original activity, further solidifying the association between rumination and suffering. It is a cyclical process driven by the initial unchallenged assumption. Consider the physiological processes within the body. Temperature fluctuates, heart rate varies, brainwave patterns shift constantly. These variations are not inherently pathological, they are functions of a dynamic system. To designate a specific pattern as deviant requires a pre-existing criterion, a point of reference deemed healthy or normal. The criterion is imposed, not discovered. Similarly, the designation of rumination as aberrant relies on an imposed standard of mental operation. The societal reinforcement of this assumption perpetuates the cycle. Mental well-being is frequently defined in opposition to rumination. Diagnostic categories reflect this opposition. Discussions surrounding mental health often center on eliminating or reducing rumination. This framing solidifies its negative connotation. The expectation of a mentally healthy individual implicitly excludes the capacity for prolonged introspective thought. The consequence is an intensified sense of failure when such thought occurs. The term rumination describes a particular pattern of cognitive processing, the repetitive revisiting of thoughts or experiences. It is an activity, not a failing. The activity exists on a spectrum. The intensity, duration, and content of rumination vary considerably. Some individuals experience brief, inconsequential periods of repetitive thought. Others engage in extended, complex sequences. The spectrum demonstrates that rumination is a common feature of human cognition, not a rare anomaly. The subjective experience of distress is entirely contingent on the pre-existing assumption. Remove the assumption, and the activity is simply a process. It is neither inherently positive nor negative. The discomfort then vanishes, not through intervention, but through re-evaluation. The feeling itself ceases, lacking its customary foundation. The designation of a mental process as aberrant relies entirely upon an imposed frame of reference. It is a provisional designation, subject to re-examination. A system of classification does not dictate the nature of experience. The impulse to control thought appears, on initial inspection, logically sound. The experience of consciously shifting focus, of diverting attention from a persistent line of reasoning, offers a momentary validation. This impression fuels a belief that ruminative thoughts, those recurring patterns of mental activity, can be managed through directed effort. A system of cognitive control is assumed to exist, a capacity for direct mental intervention. This assumption, however, proves unstable under scrutiny. The feeling of successful redirection is superficial. The very act of labeling a thought as undesirable and then attempting to banish it does not erase it. Instead, it establishes a relationship, a dynamic of opposition between the observer and the observed. The thought, now designated as something to be fought, gains a certain prominence. The attempt at suppression paradoxically invests it with an increased significance. Consider the mechanics of the intervention. The process requires constant monitoring. A vigilant awareness is necessary to detect the return of the thought, to recognize its resurgence. This vigilance itself consumes mental resources. The act of suppressing, therefore, necessitates the sustained application of effort, a continuous expenditure of energy directed at a specific, unwanted mental state. This sustained application generates an underlying tension. The effort to control breeds a counter-reaction, a feeling of being held back, of internal restriction. The original discomfort of the thought becomes compounded by the discomfort of the control strategy itself. The overall experience becomes more burdensome, more taxing than the initial occurrence of the thought would have been. The perceived efficacy of willpower strengthens this erroneous assumption. Willpower is often conceived as a limitless resource, a wellspring of internal power capable of overcoming any obstacle. This notion is inaccurate. Willpower functions within constraints, diminishing with use. The repeated deployment of effort to control thought depletes these reserves, leading to frustration and a sense of failure when the control inevitably falters. The intermittent successes, those moments when a thought seems to genuinely disappear, further reinforce the mistaken premise. These temporary absences are not evidence of control. They are the natural fluctuations of mental activity. Thoughts arise and pass away, regardless of any intentional intervention. Attributing their cessation to the exertion of willpower obscures this inherent impermanence. The system built on this flawed assumption is inherently fragile. The inevitable failure to maintain constant control produces a cycle of suppression, rebound, and renewed suppression. The intensity of the original thought may be compounded by the frustration and self-reproach arising from the failed attempt at control. The perceived lack of agency generates further dissatisfaction. The claim of direct control, therefore, lacks empirical support. The experience of temporary redirection does not demonstrate a fundamental capacity for mental management. The belief in willpower as a mechanism for overcoming unwanted thoughts is a misinterpretation of fluctuating mental phenomena. The entire structure collapses as a consequence of acknowledging the conditional nature of perceived control. It is a fabrication of the mind. The persistence of a felt unity is frequently attributed to prolonged mental activity. One encounters episodes where thought appears to flow without interruption, a continuous current of reflection. This continuity is readily interpreted as evidence of a cohesive whole, a singular experience. Discomfort arises when this perceived unity encounters a disquieting element. The very sense of being, of existing within a sustained mental state, falters when confronted with an unresolvable internal contradiction. This disruption generates a distinct dissatisfaction, a sense of something being amiss within the supposedly unbroken stream. The notion of unity, as applied to mental experience, functions through a particular perceptual framework. We are accustomed to perceiving cause and effect, action and reaction. This inclination extends to the observation of thought. One thought appears to logically follow another, creating an impression of sequence. Emotional states emerge, shift, and then seemingly dissolve into further emotional states. Sensations register, fade, and are replaced by new sensations. This predictable pattern reinforces the idea of a connected chain, a singular process unfolding over time. However, closer examination challenges this assumption of cohesion. The sustained mental activity, the apparent flow, does not necessarily signify a unified experience. Instead, it reveals a succession of discrete events. Thoughts arise, remain for a duration, and then cease. Feelings similarly manifest, alter, and disappear. Sensations register and pass. Each event possesses its own origin, its own cessation, independent of what precedes or follows it. The perceived continuity is an interpretive addition, a layer imposed upon the raw sequence. The feeling of unity is not inherent within these discrete events. It is a construct arising from the tendency to observe them as interconnected. The observer, employing a framework of sequence and cause, attributes a relational quality to each element. This attribution produces the illusion of a continuous experience where none actually exists. The perception of a single, unbroken episode is a function of this imposed structure. To insist upon the unity of a ruminative episode is to misinterpret the underlying process. The feeling of being trapped, the sense of a relentless cycle, stems directly from this false assumption. Attempting to analyze the unity, to dissect the perceived whole, only perpetuates the discomfort. The search for coherence within an incoherent arrangement is itself a source of frustration. The very term episode suggests a bounded, unified phenomenon. This definition reinforces the mistaken assumption. To discard the term is not to deny the observation of extended mental activity, but to release it from the constraints of an artificial framework. The succession of thoughts, feelings, and sensations remains. They are events arising and passing, utterly independent of each other. The sense of a persistent, unbroken whole dissolves when the observing mind ceases to impose it. It is simply a sequence. The experience is familiar. A thought returns, seemingly from nowhere, then again and again. It holds a certain gravity, a weight that suggests it must signify something essential. The recurrence itself feels like proof. A person observes this pattern and interprets it as evidence of a persistent truth, a truth about the self, about the nature of existence, about the reasons for things. This is the foundation upon which further thought is built, a presumed bedrock of understanding. This presumed bedrock generates dissatisfaction. The thought, while seemingly significant, does not resolve itself. Its presence becomes a constant, a source of subtle disturbance. It demands attention, even when the attention is unwelcome. A person attempts to analyze the thought, to dissect its meaning, to integrate it into a larger system of beliefs. This analysis, however, invariably fails to deliver the anticipated clarity. The thought remains stubbornly itself, a recurring phenomenon without discernible purpose. The assumption that recurrence equates to truth operates under specific conditions. It requires the presence of a subject perceiving the recurrence. It depends on the subject's pre-existing framework of beliefs, the lens through which the recurrence is interpreted. It relies on a desire for meaning, a human inclination to find patterns and narratives even where they do not inherently exist. Without these conditions, the recurrence would simply be a sequence of mental events, no more intrinsically meaningful than any other. Consider the mechanics. A thought arises. It triggers a cascade of associated ideas, memories, and emotions. These associations, in turn, reinforce the original thought, creating a feedback loop. The loop is not driven by external reality. It is a product of internal connections. The more a thought is entertained, the stronger the connections become, the more frequent the recurrence. The frequency does not reflect an underlying truth, it reflects the strength of the cognitive pathway. Any pathway, regardless of its origins, can become reinforced by repetition. The impulse to trace philosophical origins within this recurrence is a continuation of the initial error. It is a projection of significance onto a process that is inherently impersonal. The thought itself is not a messenger from a deeper source. It is a consequence of neural activity, a pattern of electrical and chemical signals. Attributing philosophical weight to this pattern obscures the pattern itself. It shifts the focus from the mechanics of recurrence to a fabricated source of meaning. The effort to determine the origin of a recurring thought is itself a product of the mistaken assumption. The recurrence remains a recurrence. The perceived significance fades. The expectation of revelation dissipates. The cognitive loop continues, but its intensity diminishes. The framework of beliefs supporting the original interpretation weakens. The impulse to analyze the thought subsides. It continues to return, but it no longer feels burdensome. It is simply a phenomenon, like any other transient mental event, existing within the constant flux of experience. The assumption collapses into nothing. There is only the passing of thoughts. The experience of persistent thought often feels tethered to a particular place within the mind. A sense of ownership arises. These thoughts, this narrative, originate. This feeling contributes to a perception of a discrete mental structure, a container responsible for the generation and maintenance of these recurring patterns. Discomfort frequently accompanies this process. The repetitive nature of the thought itself can be unsettling. The feeling of being held captive by an internal monologue breeds a dissatisfaction directly linked to this perceived locus of origin. This sense of a defined origin seems coherent. The subjective sensation is that these thoughts arise from within, are directed by something located within consciousness. It feels as if a controller, however subtle, is orchestrating the sequence. The accompanying physical sensations, a tightening in the chest, a pressure behind the eyes, further reinforce this impression of a localized source. Consequently, efforts are frequently directed toward this identified point. Attempts are made to quiet it, to control it, to understand its function. The focus remains on the perceived origin, the assumed locus. This perception is shaped by a tendency toward compartmentalization. The mind is commonly understood as a system of discrete modules, each possessing specific functions and boundaries. This conceptual framework encourages the attribution of discrete origins to mental phenomena. Thoughts, emotions, memories, each is placed within its designated compartment. This organization facilitates understanding, providing a framework for categorizing and predicting mental activity. The assumption of a localized origin naturally fits within this compartmentalized understanding of the mind. However, a closer examination reveals a more complex reality. Persistent thought does not spring from a single, isolated point. It arises from the interaction of multiple neural networks, a dynamic interplay of cognitive processes distributed throughout the brain. These networks engage in constant communication, reinforcing and shaping the thought patterns that are experienced. The feeling of a localized origin is an interpretive layer added to this complex interaction, a simplification of a more diffused process. The sensation of ownership is a construct, not a description of the underlying mechanisms. The perceived locus is not a fixed entity. It is a relational phenomenon dependent on the ongoing interaction of these distributed networks. The feeling of a defined origin shifts and fluctuates with changes in brain state. It alters with fatigue, with attention, with even subtle shifts in physiology. The assumption of a bounded mental structure, therefore, proves conditional, reliant on a particular mode of observation. It is a perspective, not an intrinsic property of the experience itself. The feeling dissolves when this perspective is questioned. The perceived locus, the felt ownership, the assumption of compartmentalization, all unravel under direct inquiry. The experience persists, but the framework that defined it ceases to exist. The initial feeling of tethering releases. The persistence of a specific assumption creates a peculiar impasse. We assume that language can adequately explain rumination. This assumption dictates the form of our inquiry. We routinely analyze ruminative processes using verbal description. We attempt to categorize, define, and ultimately understand rumination through linguistic structures. This approach feels logical. Ruminative content is routinely communicated in language. Accounts of internal states are typically expressed through words. The process of introspection often involves translating experience into verbal report. This translation, however, introduces a deviation. The attempt to articulate a mental state fundamentally alters that state. Description does not equate to experience. The act of naming, of assigning a label, creates a separation between the observer and the observed. This separation, however subtle, results in a distortion. The original experience is filtered, interpreted, and ultimately reduced to a linguistic construct. The feeling itself is not the linguistic representation of the feeling. The structure of language demands a subject and an object. To describe rumination, we must identify a self that is ruminating and a rumination that is being ruminated upon. This division, inherent in language, is absent from the raw experience. The sense of a separate self engaged in an activity of rumination arises of the description. The assumption that language can capture the totality of the process inadvertently creates the process it intends to understand. The maintenance of this assumption depends on an unexamined belief that internal states are inherently accessible through linguistic analysis. Yet, there is no evidence supporting this assertion. The reliance on verbal reporting reinforces the framework of a divided self. Every articulation, every attempt to clarify the nature of rumination further solidifies the distinction. The perceived clarity provided by language is, in fact, the illusion of understanding. This reliance is not arbitrary. Language is essential for communication and coordination. It serves a vital function in navigating the external world. Applying this same tool to the interior landscape, however, generates a flawed perspective. The assumption becomes self-sustaining. The more we attempt to describe rumination through language, the more pronounced the separation becomes. The feeling of dissatisfaction, of being unable to grasp the essence of the experience, then arises. This dissatisfaction is a direct consequence of the assumption itself. The assumption that language can adequately explain rumination is not a foundational truth. It is a construct, a framework that shapes our perception. The persistence of this framework creates a cycle of description and distortion. The experience of rumination is independent of any linguistic articulation. The structure of language, when applied to the internal landscape, produces a false representation of the original process. The division between observer and observed is a product of the description, not an inherent characteristic of the experience. The assumption, upon closer observation, dissolves into its own inherent limitations. The attribution of persistent thought patterns to an immutable aspect of character generates a certain rigidity in self-perception, a consistent tendency toward reflection, dwelling on past events or anticipating future outcomes, often leads to the conclusion that this propensity defines a person. Such a conclusion feels logical, given the apparent stability of these patterns over time. The individual experiencing these recurring thoughts perceives them as intrinsic, a fixed element in their being. This perception, however, constitutes a mistaken assumption. The discomfort arising from this assumption stems from the resultant limitation it places on potential. When behavior is understood as an immutable characteristic, the possibility of change diminishes. Effort to alter thought patterns becomes discouraging, seen as a struggle against something fundamental. Self-criticism intensifies, reinforcing the conviction of inherent deficiency. The perceived permanence of the trait fuels frustration. The individual concludes that their capacity for mental freedom is constricted by the very nature of their character. Examination reveals the contingency of these thought patterns. The assumption of immutability fails upon closer inspection. Factors external to the individual demonstrably influence the frequency and intensity of reflective thought. Significant life events, alterations in routine, even changes in diet can shift the prevalence of these patterns. The influence of interpersonal relationships, the impact of social pressures, and exposure to varying environments all play a role. These are not minor adjustments, they represent demonstrable shifts in the landscape of mental activity. Consider a period of heightened stress. The individual, previously capable of brief periods of focused attention, may find themselves trapped in cycles of unproductive thought. The stressor itself introduces a new element, a condition shaping the way the mind operates. This condition is temporary, yet it significantly alters the appearance of the individual's character. Conversely, a period of relative calm can facilitate a loosening of these patterns, allowing for greater mental clarity. This does not represent a change in character, it reflects a change in conditions. The connection between behavior and personality traits is frequently overstated. A behavior observed repeatedly is not necessarily a manifestation of an inherent quality. It is a response to circumstances, a reaction to stimuli. The apparent solidity of these reactions is a product of observation over a limited time frame. To infer immutability from transient behavior is to draw an incorrect conclusion from incomplete data. The patterns themselves are not inherent. The patterns are reactive. The framework that supports this mistaken assumption begins to dissolve when viewed as a consequence of circumstance. The individual's perceived limitations, their self-defined boundaries, are revealed to be fluid, responsive to forces beyond the self. The initial conclusion, that persistent thought patterns reflect an immutable aspect of character, dissolves, leaving behind only the observable sequence of events. It becomes apparent that such sequences are contingent. The belief persists that recurring thought possesses a direct causal power over subsequent events. This belief feels empirically sound. Repeated contemplation undeniably shapes behavior. We observe a person dwelling on a perceived slight and subsequently acting with resentment. The connection seems straightforward. However, this apparent directness warrants scrutiny. The assumed causality arises from a tendency to perceive a linear relationship between mental states and external outcomes. A thought is entertained and a consequence follows. The sequence appears meaningful and causative. It is an understandable process, given the speed and complexity of experience. Yet, this perceived directness obscures underlying mechanisms. The influence attributed to ruminative content is frequently mediated by cognitive biases. The bias of confirmation, for example, strengthens the initial thought through selective attention. Information aligning with the ruminated concern receives greater weight. Disconfirming evidence is discounted or reinterpreted, solidifying the perception of a causal link. This process reinforces the initial thought, regardless of its objective validity. Furthermore, interpretive frameworks shape the perceived consequence. A perceived slight, endlessly rehearsed, is framed within a narrative of injustice. This narrative provides a justification for resentment and dictates a corresponding response. The response, the action stemming from the resentment, is not a direct consequence of the original thought itself. It is a consequence of the narrative constructed around that thought. This narrative is a condition, a prerequisite for the action to occur. The experience of suffering, often accompanying ruminative thought, emerges not from the thought itself, but from the assumed causal power. The individual expects a particular outcome based on the perceived causal link. When that expectation is unmet, frustration arises. The frustration contributes to an escalation of the ruminative cycle, reinforcing the initial faulty assumption. The expectation itself is a product of the initially mistaken belief. Investigation of the mechanisms by which thoughts influence behavior is not necessary to understand this process. It is sufficient to observe that the perceived directness is an interpretive construction. The construction relies on cognitive biases and reinforcing narrative frameworks. It presents a simplified model of a significantly more complex reality. The belief in direct causality, therefore, does not accurately reflect the relational nature of mental phenomena. It is, in itself, a condition. The connection between recurring thought and subsequent action is less coherent and causal than it is presented to be. The feeling persists that thought originates from a fixed point. It is an enduring sensation, this sense of an internal locus for mental activity. The experience of rumination reinforces this impression. It feels as if a continuous process is unfolding, emanating from somewhere within the mind. This feeling contributes to a sense of internal stability, a presumption of a constant source. The feeling is naturally apprehended as an ongoing, directed effort. This presumed source is not immediately observable. It is inferred from the consequences of thought, from the narratives that arise and persist. Dissatisfaction frequently arises from the entanglement within these narratives. The insistence upon a stable origin creates a framework for analysis. This framework encourages an interpretation of thought as action, as stemming from an agent. The agent is then implicitly responsible for the content of thought. The assumption of a stable source finds support in common linguistic habits. Language structure privileges the attribution of agency. It is inherent within many forms of expression that actions are produced by actors. This linguistic scaffolding reinforces the thought sense of internal origination. It is a pattern that extends beyond the immediate experience of rumination. It governs broader explanations of behavior and consequence. However, the assumed stability does not withstand scrutiny. Examination of neural processes reveals a dynamism absent from the presumption. Neural activity is demonstrably transient and interdependent. It is not directed by a centralized source, but emerges from the complex interplay of firing patterns. These patterns are fluid and constantly shifting. They do not represent the thing pointed to. This differentiation is critical for understanding the nature of thought. The feeling of a fixed origin is contingent upon a certain mode of apprehension. This apprehension is itself a product of neural activity. It is an interpretation layered onto the raw experience of thought. It is not an intrinsic property of the phenomena being observed. The experience of rumination, the feeling of a persistent source, is conditional. It is dependent on the observer and their current neural configuration. The experience of rumination, then, does not represent the action of an originating entity. It reflects a temporary alignment of physiological processes. The assumption of a constant source lacks empirical basis. The felt sense of origination dissolves upon closer consideration. It is an artifact of interpretive framing, not a description of underlying reality. The feeling of a persistent origin ceases. The persistence of certain thought patterns frequently generates a perception of a unified mental source. This perception is understandable. Recurring sequences appear to emanate from a single, identifiable process. It is assumed that these sequences represent a discrete cognitive operation. This assumption operates as a structuring principle for experience. It allows for a degree of predictability within the otherwise chaotic flow of mental activity. The consequence of this assumption is a tendency to locate ownership within a singular construct. Thoughts are attributed to I, as if originating from a fixed and continuous entity. Dissatisfaction arises when the thought patterns are undesirable or when attempts to control them fail. The effort to suppress or alter these sequences reinforces the perceived solidity of the originating process. The more one struggles against a particular pattern, the more ingrained it becomes. This is not necessarily a deliberate effort. It can be an unconscious response to discomfort. The assumption's validity rests on an inherent impulse toward simplification. Human understanding often prioritizes clear categories over the nuances of complex systems. Mental phenomena are particularly susceptible to this simplification. Reducing the complexity of cognition to a manageable framework is appealing. It provides a sense of control and coherence. The framework, however, is built upon a foundation that is not entirely accurate. Examination reveals that the sequence of thoughts does not arise from a discrete process. It is instead the product of numerous interacting cognitive elements. Each element contributes a fraction to the overall appearance of a unified pattern. These elements are not confined to a specific location or function. They arise and pass away, influenced by a constellation of factors. The patterns are not generated, they emerge. They are a consequence of the interconnectedness of various cognitive processes. The perceived unity is an artifact of observation, not an inherent property. Recognizing the elements involved does not require identification of each specific component. It simply involves acknowledging that the sequence is not a singular entity. The patterns are transient combinations of activity fluctuating in intensity and form. The experience of rumination, for example, is not generated by a single source, but by the overlapping and reinforcing of several separate functions. These functions include recall, evaluation, anticipation, and attention. Each of these operates independently. Their convergence creates the impression of a cohesive process. The impulse towards simplification, which initially established the assumption, now obscures the underlying reality. To maintain the illusion of a singular originating process requires a continuous effort of interpretation. This effort perpetuates the experience of ownership and the associated discomfort. Removing the interpretive layer does not eliminate the constituent elements, it merely dissolves the constructed unity. The assumption then ceases to function as a structuring principle. The flow of experience remains devoid of the imposed order. The perception of a singular cognitive process dissipates. It is a convergence.